Sorry, I don't think it had started. So do you want to just repeat that? I think everybody should be in the thing now. So if you just want to carry
Okay,
on.
I kicked off too early. I'll start my introduction again, everyone. I'm not sure if anyone saw that. So good evening and welcome to the first of a new induction series that's been put together by Young Rail Professionals and Network Rail in collaboration. This series, the Welcome to Rail Induction series, has been put together over the last 6 months by hardworking volunteers through Young Rail Professionals, our colleagues in Network Rail, and industry partners from across the railway industry. It's a new series we're putting together this year and plan to deliver on an annual basis, designed for those new to the UK rail industry, people early in their careers, and even for those who have been in their careers a little longer and hoping to learn something new. And it's really to look at some of the key theories and principles underlining how the UK industry works. For example, what some of the key engineering concepts are and how it works within the industry. And some of the key policies and decisions that have brought the industry to where we are now. We'll also be looking at some of the key challenges and opportunities that are facing the industry. It's been an incredibly turbulent 18 months, as all of you know. And we also have key, big changes coming to the industry, as will be discussed later. And it's also a chance to look at some of the key impacts on the industry that new policies are going to have as we go forward. Next slide, please, Jacob. So just to look at who's been delivering this and give some credit where it's due, this series has been put together by 3 members of Young Rail Professionals. Isabella Lawson, who is the Young Rail Professionals Rail Week Manager, and in her day job is a policy executive at the Railway Industry Association. Jacob Cooper, who you can see on screen, he's a networking and development manager for Young Rail Professionals and a program manager in capital delivery for Network Rail. And myself, I'm the head of initiatives for Young Rail Professionals, so I look after a series of different initiatives. And in my day job, I'm a project manager for CPC Project Services. Next slide, please, Jacob. So I'm sure many of you are aware of Young Rail Professionals, but as this is aimed at new entrants to the industry, it's worth just giving you a brief understanding of who we are and what we do. And if you are members now, I highly encourage you to sign up. Young Rail Professionals was set up in 2009. It's a not-for-profit organisation entirely led by volunteers. We have approximately 70 or 80 volunteers across the UK based over 7 different regions. It's entirely free to join. It's CPT accredited, and I think we have over 6,000 members now across the UK and actually internationally as well. Our key functions, if I go to the next slide, please, Jacob. So our key goals and our mission are to promote the industry, celebrating the achievements of young professionals working within it. To inspire, so we try and showcase the best of what rail has to offer and inspire our colleagues and those perhaps thinking about careers in rail to make their contribution and change. And we seek to develop, so we run lots of development events such as the one today to try and help people grow their careers and reach their highest potential. Our key values are to be inclusive, everyone is welcome, collaborative, so as evidenced by tonight, we work with partners from across the industry, committed, so it's run by some very hardworking volunteers who are committed to this program and this cause, lead by example, and to have fun. So hopefully we deliver that as well. Next, please, Jacob. So this new program falls under the initiatives wing of Young Rail Professionals. This is just a look at some of the other initiatives we run in case you're interested in finding out more. We run a Heritage Rail program which delivers trips and working weekends on heritage railways. We have a event coming up again in November to the Ffestiniog Railway in Wales. We run Rail Week, which took place last week, which is a big cross-industry event where lots of organisations deliver events aimed at promoting the industry to young people that may be interested in future careers. Young Rail Tours, which delivers tours domestically and across the world for members who want to learn from other railways, meet international colleagues, and share collaborative learning. Just as a plug, we have an event just launched in November to the Isle of Wight. If you go on our website, you'll find out more. We also run a yearly annual awards dinner and black tie dinner, which Jacob is running at the moment. And we run the Interrail program, which is a program designed to promote careers in rails to people in schools, colleges, universities, or thinking of changing careers, such as the armed forces. Next slide, please, Jacob. So I'm now going to hand over to Mark Hodgson. He's the Head of Talent and Organisational Development at Network Rail and a key partner in delivering this programme. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Paul, and good evening, everyone. I guess I'd like to say that we've all started a career at some point, in our lifetime, many of us many times over, and starting a career in a complex organisation can be a really daunting prospect. We all know that, and the railway industry is definitely an industry that's a complex environment, with so many organisations working together behind the scenes to keep our rail services running safely. And I guess we have a real focus on passengers and freight users. So mindful of the complexity that represents our industry, Network Rail are really pleased to have been working with the YRP team over the last 6 months, as Paul said, to help join the dots and really help bring alive our railway as a system. And we're doing this through the Welcome to Rail induction programme. I would like to say big thanks to Erica Diaz in the Network Rail team, who's helped put this opportunity on the map and make this happen on our side. I'm really hopeful that the event and the future seminars that we've organised for you will help provide a context to learn more about the railway as a system, and enable you all, I guess, as individuals, me included, to be more confident when we connect and collaborate with each other, both now and in the future. So in terms of this particular event, please be present during the session, do interact with our speakers, and I very much hope that you'll enjoy the seminar. So many thanks, and I'll hand back over now to Paul to move us on.
Over to me, I think, just to run through a bit of a schedule for the actual initiative itself. So today we have the history and future of UK Rail, as you know. Then next Monday we have Welcome to Rail Senior Leader Q&A. So we'll be joined by Andrew Haynes, Jack Starr, and Diane Crowther, and that will be a hosted Q&A session by Nigel Harris. So an absolutely amazing opportunity to ask and listen to some of the most senior leaders in rail. So if you haven't signed up to that, I urge you to sign up to it. Following on, we'll have a life on the life of a train, so an introduction to rolling stock and infrastructure. And then on the 3rd of November, we will have an event called Staying on Track, which will be an introduction to track and infrastructure, so a number of different infrastructure and discipline presented by a number of people within Network Rail. We'll then move on to an introduction to signalling and control, followed on the 17th of November by a case study of a railway mega project, which will be on HS2. And then lastly, we'll move on to modern innovations in UK Rail. So we'll be giving an overview of some of the most significant innovations in the industry at the moment, and we'll be joined by some recent award winners from innovation-related competitions. So just moving on to today's agenda then. So we'll shortly be joined by Simon Kendler, who you can see on the screen, who's a route freight manager at Network Rail. So Simon will be discussing and providing an overview of the history of rail. And then shortly after that, we'll be joined by Michael Clark. So Michael is a Director of Policy and Rail Reform at the Great British Railways Transition Team. For each session, we'll take around about 15 minutes Q&A after each section. Maybe that we don't get back to, we're able to answer all of your questions. So please put questions in the chat, and we'll take them. We'll present them at the end of the session. If we can't get back to you, we'll see whether we can collate the questions and some answers, and get back to you after the event. And that is everything from me. So I'm going to hand over now to Simon. So Simon, if you want to introduce yourself, and I'll make you presenter now, and then we can.
Hello, you should be able to hear me. I should be able to do this, and then I should be able to do this, and you should be able to see my slides. Shout if not.
Give me a second, you will be able to. Yeah.
see my slides?
Yeah, we got them.
Super. All right. Thank you for the introduction, Jacob, and from Paul and team, and welcome to the history of Britain's railways. Yes, I know history, but I'll try and make it interesting. We're going to canter through some of the history of Britain's railway development over the years. So we'll start off with the history of railways and their kind of origins, and then we'll speed up right up to the present day before we hand over to the thing you're really here for, which is of course about Great British Railways and the future. So I'll kick off here. So before we talk about Great British Railways, here's a map of Great Britain's railways. For the purposes of this talk, we will be excluding the Republic of Ireland. That's a whole different kettle of fish, as is Northern Ireland, which is a devolved transport authority. We will be focusing on the history of the railways and the running of the railways, development and future of the railways running in England, Wales and Scotland. And so that just to set the scene a little bit there. So early railways, many will think of things like this, the Catch Me Who Can, Richard Trevithick's locomotive running around somewhere near Euston Square, not far from the Eversholt Street office, and the locomotive, it was also a Trevithick invention for the early 1800s. But whilst railways certainly came to the fore in the terms of mechanisation and the Industrial Revolution, railways actually date back a little earlier than this. In fact, the kind of conjure up in your mind of things like this, the 1825 opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, one of the first railways to have steam locomotives powering wagons full of people and things like coal, and the Liverpool to Manchester Railway, the world's first intercity railway, two-track railway, signalling, all these kind of things were world firsts. But railway origins go back a few hundred years before to things like this. That's a mine cart from the 16th century from Transylvania. There were mine railways with wagonways and rutways in Germany that date back to at least the 1500s. And then they have these metal trackways. This is the kind of thing that Richard Trevithick's locomotive would have been trundling along, and horse-drawn wagons there. A lot of wagons being drawn by approximately 4 horsepower there on the Little Eaton gangway during the 1800s. So railways don't necessarily start their story in Britain. They don't necessarily start their story in the Industrial Revolution. In fact, there are some claims that wagonways of some description can be traced right back to early Chinese empires and so on and so forth. So it's really the mechanisation that we focus on when we come to Britain's history, but also it was the development of railways and industrialisation, which also had a strong link to colonial history. And of course, that's imbued with some things which were not so great in terms of our history, things like slavery, which was a thing that industrial nations like Britain made money off the back of before it was eventually abolished. And I think it's exciting that as a research project about to be launched with the support of Network Rail and Network Rail's chair, Sir Peter Hendy, which is well summed up by a quote here from one of the professors on it, Professor Finch from the University of York. I'll read out the quote, which is that the relationship between steam power and global trade is complex. Steam engines replaced wind power on the plantations and water power in British cotton mills. Steamboats transported raw materials and goods around the globe. And railways were critical to the expansion of colonial power across Asia and Africa, as well as the opening up of the North American interior. And wealth generated in the colonies was a stimulus to industrialisation long after the abolition of slavery in the UK and the US. An important note, because it's important to be aware of all aspects of history and how important the railways were in terms of that historical moment, and certainly in light of some of the developments we've been having in our modern times in the last 12 to 18 months. But moving on, we have the development of the railways, and two figures that dominated in the 19th century the railway development were these two figures here, which is Brunel on the left, who was the engineer behind the Great Western Railway's expansion west of London towards Bristol, Wales, and the southwest. And you have George Stephenson, who surveyed many, many railways across the rest of the country and led to a battle of the gauges. I say track gauges, don't get confused with loading gauge. Track gauge, the width between the rails. Loading gauge is the size of the thing you can run on said rails. Brunel was the proponent of the broad gauge, the wider track gauge, 7 foot and a quarter inch. And Stephenson's gauge became known as standard gauge. And indeed, it was legislation, which was the 1846 Regulation of Railways Gauge Act, which actually was brought in order to allow for a standardization. Hence, you come up with the term indeed of standard gauge for railways. So that is the gauges. That's why we have, one of the reasons why we have a standard gauge. Although not to be confused with the fact that in Ireland they standardised on a different gauge, but that is somewhat of another story. So hopefully the next slide will load. My computer's being a bit slow. Maybe that'll do it. There we go. So safety, another aspect of moving things at faster speeds is safety. And here are a few scenes on the aftermath of some accidents of old. On the bottom left is Staplehurst, which took place on the 9th of June 1865. One of the famous survivors of that wreckage was a certain writer called Charles Dickens. On the top right, you have the Tay Bridge disaster, 18th of December 1879, a bridge not built to the best of quality standards. In a gale, a train went over it and the bridge failed, and the train and the bridge section collapsed into the stormy River Tay with no survivors. And also on the bottom right, a very important one, which I know I just said before, we're not talking much about Northern Ireland, but we are going to mention the crash at Armagh, which took place on the 12th of June 1889, which led to another regulation of the Railway Act, which was to adopt certain safety measures, such as block signalling, interlocking of points and signals, which is just standard practice these days, and indeed computerised in the modern railway, and also to provide trains with continuous brakes. This accident was caused by splitting the train, which then lost braking power, and the train careered down a hill with tragic circumstances. So safety became a key development over the years, and safety regulations and technologies evolved with the railway as well, as shown here. So railway mania descended on the country from the 1840s onwards, and by 1900 Britain was crisscrossed with a dense network of railways. Was this because of this was the best way to serve people? No, not necessarily. There were many railway companies whose many objectives included making profits, and that meant that they were trying to get often to the same places. There were companies trying to get to the coal fields of Nottinghamshire and various other mining areas and industrial heartlands, and there were different railway companies competing, which is why you could go to Manchester from stations like Paddington, Marylebone, Euston, St Pancras and King's Cross. You could go to Manchester from all those stations at one point. It would have been possible with direct trains, and that was due to the pre-grouping companies. What's the pre-grouping? Well, pre-grouping before World War I. This is just a summary of some of the railway companies that are there. Although you'll notice that some of the names are popular on the modern railway, London North Western, for example. After the First World War, these were grouped into 4 companies called the Big Four: the Great Western Railway, the London Midland Scottish Railway, the London North Eastern Railway, and the Southern Railway. After the war efforts took a bit of a toll on the railway infrastructure, and the Labour government of the day, the flavour of the month, such as in the spirit of the founding of the NHS National Health Service, nationalisation was on the agenda, and that meant also the nationalisation of Britain's railways as British Railways. But harking back to the pre-war years, pre-Second World War, in the Roaring 30s, development of the railways led to some of what some consider the golden age of steam traction. The Great Western Railway developed, arguably in the early 20th century, the modern-looking steam engine. The latest evolution of that here, the King class. On the top right is the very striking-looking Coronation Scot, developed by the LMS under William Stanier. This locomotive broke the speed record in 1938 and also crashed into Crewe Station, but although the only thing that was injured was the crockery in the restaurant car. And they was going to do no more speed runs, but the LNER still managed to sneak one in under the guise of a brake test the 3rd of July 1938 with this blue engine here, the 4468 LNER A4 class Mallard, which reached 126.25 miles an hour for a quarter of a mile just north of Peterborough, and is still the world record holder for the fastest steam locomotive in the world for now. And on the bottom right you have the Bullied Pacifics, which were a little bit more of an austere design, but again taking the best principles of all and running expresses on the southern region to destinations such as Devon, and indeed down to the south coast to get to the ports to take passengers across on the Orient Express. So this is the golden age of steam, but by the time that steam ended in the 1960s, this is what steam was really more remembered for. It was dirty, it was grimy, and the 1960s there were better jobs on offer which could be undertaken in cleaner environments, and also in terms of transport, the modern car and road transport, lorries and such like, were becoming much cheaper to use and were becoming much more popular, and therefore the age of steam, and indeed the romance of steam, really seemed to have long gone by this point. Also, the 1960s, modernisation was on the agenda, and that led to this man popping onto the scene, a certain Dr. Richard Beeching, although most people in the railway remember him more like this, who was the man who was tasked with slashing costs and closing many railway lines with his reshaping of the railways report. Now, yes, Beeching was tasked to find economies, particularly on rural lines which were loss-making, and most people remember Dr. Richard Beeching for doing this to Britain's railways, closing lots of it and leaving lots of it derelict and ripping up duplicate routes, the duplicate routes that I've mentioned a little bit before, with different companies going to the same places. But really, it's a little bit unfair, because Dr. Richard Beeching's mission was to try and save Britain's railways, and he also brought in modernisation, things like this. The beginning of containerised freight, which is now the biggest sector of rail freight we have running at the moment in this country. And modernisation also looked like this, with electrification of the West Coast Main Line, clean, blue, shiny electric locomotives flying along at 100 miles an hour effortlessly. But that did require the rationalisation of the railway, so that between 1963 and 1984, the railway started to look more like it does on the right-hand side. You can see the dense network was thinned out, the number of stations reduced, and the track mileage reduced dramatically as practices changed as well. Modernisation kept a pace, and in the 1970s, we were thinking about how to modernise the railway. Electrification seemed to be the way forward, but before we could afford all that and bring out the advanced passenger train, a stopgap was introduced called the HST, or the Intercity 125. This stopgap wasn't much of a stopgap, because indeed, even though these first trains were built in 1976, they're still running now on Great Western Railway, and indeed you can get them on cross country going all the way from Plymouth to Scotland. So a very, very iconic design, albeit maybe shouldn't necessarily be in service still today, but the HSTs revolutionised journeys when introduced onto the Western region in 1976, and on the East Coast Main Line in 1978 became known as, in some senses, as the journey shrinkers, and also the fastest diesels in the world, hitting 148 miles an hour on test, and revolutionised travel and shrinking journey times, and became a staple of the intercity railway. And as the intercity railway became more developed, the shape of intercity futures was supposed to look like this. This is the APTP, the Advanced Passenger Train. What was special about this? Well, you'll see now. Tilting round the curves at high speed. It holds the record for being the fastest train from London to Glasgow, even though earlier this year they tried to break it. The APT from 1984 still holds the record. Avanti West Coast almost beat it by 21 seconds, but they were out. And these trains were supposed to revolutionise travel, particularly on the West Coast Main Line, and be introduced as the standard electric fleet of train. But these were a little bit too clever for their time. The funding was pulled, and eventually the technology ended up in our modern Pendolino trains. In fact, the very trains that we're now running on the West Coast Main Line to Glasgow and tried to beat the record, that technology eventually reached its way back to the West Coast Main Line, albeit via the Italians and Alstom. But the technology wasn't dumped in terms of British applications as well. The electronic traction gear ended up in one of these fine trains, which heralded the era of sectorisation in the 1980s. British Rail broke down into sectors. Freight sectors were broken down into smaller commodities, and the passenger railway was split into intercity, into London and South East, which became Network South East, and Provincial Rail, which became Regional Railways, and then also ScotRail, which is still a recognisable brand name and the franchise operation even today. And this is arguably the peak of British Rail's intercity fleet here, with this fantastic livery. These trains also still running, although their days are left numbered. Network South East, revolutionary, bringing all of the competing companies of the old days together, all the mainline suburban railways serving London, with arguably, well, without argument, the best ever livery to have been applied to a British train ever, and that's not up for discussion. But yes, the sectorisation meant that the railway started running like a business and started to become quite profitable. Freight as well. It's interesting how Red Star was a parcel sector, and now Express Logistics is the watchword. But we used to have mail trains with Rail Express systems, the red train up above, and also the Class 60 locomotives brought in for heavy haulage of very heavy freight trains, and now we have jumbo trains running on the West Coast Main Line, the Western region. The modernisation of the railway that took shape that we know today really started to modernise in that period in the 1980s. But it wasn't to last before more change came along in the shape of privatisation, which was through the Railways Act of 1993. And this entailed British Rail, for example, being split into different bits. The infrastructure owner became Railtrack to manage and maintain the network. Train services broken down into small operating units known as franchises, and the 4 passenger sectors became 19 franchises, and the freight sectors was broken up into different bits, although actually became conglomerated again into 3 major private operators at the time. So what changed for customers and passengers? Well, not much initially, really. The trains changed colours, so you've seen these 2 types of train before. Now, these early franchises were looked on quite fondly initially, and that was partly because of the fact that they were often run by British Rail managers who had been running the services beforehand. Silverlink had a good reputation running services out of suburban services of the West Coast Main Line, and GNER as well on the East Coast Main Line. But there were problems with the reformed railway. I'm going to get to that in just a second, but the freight sector also had some major improvements before that in the shape of the Channel Tunnel opening in 1994. Eurostar services started running initially from Waterloo before the high-speed one was finished. Freight came on leaps and bounds, more containerized freight, more traffic coming through the Channel Tunnel. The mail trains came into use as well, which could haul mail anywhere across Britain's electrified network. Now, they did stop using, the Royal Mail stopped using mail trains in 2004, but it wasn't long before mail started to be used trains again, albeit in smaller numbers. But now we're going back to the principles of even perhaps having a travelling post office again, a service not seen on Britain's railway since 1970. And the watchword now is that we want more freight on rail, and we want all sorts of low carbon logistics, express parcels, and more freight on rail, which is partly what I'm supposed to be doing in my job. Now, before we move on to the next slide, let's talk a little bit more about how privatisation went in the 1990s. I'm just going to say there's a content warning. There are some distressing images coming up for those who might not want to look, because we're going to talk about some of the accidents again. So talking about necessity of safety too. Here are some of the horrible scenes that faced the railway in that turbulent period of the late 1990s and early 2000s. In the latter days of Railtrack, top left is Southall. Southall was caused by a mixture of circumstances, which meant that the safety system and the high-speed train there was isolated, and it went through a number of signals. And by the time the driver realised it was too late, there was a freight train that had been scheduled to cross the path, and the train slammed, the HST slammed into the freight train. On the right there is the Hatfield aftermath, which was a combination of things, particularly poor maintenance practices and a lack of focus on the engineering aspects of keeping the railway in top condition for the passage of trains. And that meant that this Intercity 225, operated by GNER, came around the curve at Hatfield at 104 miles an hour, and the rail beneath it shattered into many pieces, and the train derailed, and some people tragically lost their lives. And one of the last accidents that happened in the Railtrack era was on the bottom left, which was Potters Bar, where a train hit some points which hadn't been maintained properly as well, and the train derailed, and people also lost their lives here. So Railtrack, it may perhaps not entirely all down to Railtrack themselves, but they didn't do themselves any favours at that point. The infrastructure owners was not set up in a way that was particularly conducive to the incentives weren't particularly good for necessarily the safe running of the railway. But since then, many safety improvements have been made, and out of this, Network Rail was formed in 2002. So that brings us now up to more of the modern era. So you may recognise this if you've been doing your reading recently, which is this is a generalised kind of structure of the current rail industry as we see under the kind of pre-rail reform format. This has been, I basically stole this from the Williams Shapps plan for rail, and you'll see there's lots of complicated regional partners. You've got the Network Rail there, you've got the DFT, you've got the ORR. So what do all these bodies mean, and how do they interact with each other? Well, of course, this is subject to change, but you don't really know where you're going unless you know where you've come from. So very briefly, here are some of the actors that are involved currently in the running of the railway system. So sitting kind of towards the top, you have the Department for Transport, has a bit of oversight over the Welsh Government, Transport Scotland and Translink in terms of a general policy basis. But remember that in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, transport authorities are also heavily devolved. But also you have the Officer Railroad, RSSB, and then the operators and rolling stock owning companies as well sitting underneath them. A summary of the Department of Transport's situation with its government ministers responsible for transport matters directly in England and high-level transport matters in the devolved nations, setting policy and also outlining funding, and very much involved obviously in rail reform, which we'll come to in a little while. RSSB, the Rail Safety and Standards Board, very important for setting up the standards to safely operate the railway. Rail Delivery Group, which is a kind of a group of operators working together, particularly with responsibilities for ticketing. Rail Ombudsman, dealing with complaints, and the Rail Accident Investigation Branch, who you may have heard of, who were called out to Enfield yesterday when an overground train got a little bit overly familiar with the buffer stops there. And these are a few organisations there. Network Rail, I'm sure many of you will know, I certainly do, as that's who I work for, and owns, manages and maintains Britain's rail infrastructure, which looks a bit like this. You have wonderful bridges and viaducts like the Royal Border Bridge, signalling assets, stations, track, tunnels, all these structures. Now, stations is a bit of a complicated one, because stations like this one, which is Stoke Mandeville on the Chiltern route, this will be under what's called an SFO arrangement, which is the station facility operator, which is where the train operating company will manage on behalf of Network Rail, but it's still owned by Network Rail. It's a little bit complicated. That's why we're having rail reform, everyone. But Network Rail also manages stations, major ones you'll see here, lots of London ones, but also some non-London ones: Reading, Guildford, Leeds, Glasgow Central, Birmingham, New Street, some of the finest stations in the country, operated and managed by Network Rail. Network Rail's structure is broken down, generally speaking, into these kind of operational units with system operator, route services, regions and routes, and support services. And the regions and routes I mentioned look a little bit like this. This is not a 100% accurate diagram. The labels of the routes are not quite correct, but you get the general idea. There are 5 regions and 13 routes. Scotland, you've got Wales and Western, you've got Southern, Kent, Sussex and Wessex. North Western Central covers the Chiltern Line, West Coast Main Line, the Northwest, and the Eastern region, which covers Anglia, the East Coast Main Line, and the eastern side of England as well, and Scotland's Railway, which is an alliance with Network Rail and ScotRail. And in terms of the franchises I mentioned, well, this is currently a state of play. These are the many franchises plying their trade on Britain's railways at the moment, and you can get a very complicated looking map here, produced by Project Mapping, if you look them up online, of the many multitude of companies which are currently operating passenger services on Britain's railway. It is complicated, and there are lots of them, particularly around the London area. Again, I think is why there's such an appetite for reform, because complexity is certainly something that the rail industry is very good at doing, which can make things difficult when we try to get things done and improve things. Other operators that run around, on the left-hand side, the left column there, ScotRail, LER, Northern, Transport for Wales, Greater Thames Railway South Eastern, from the 17th of October, are operating or will be operated under the operator of last resort. So that's the government takeover from the franchised operator. On the right, you have TfL, Overground and Merseyrail. These are concessions which are basically operated and tendered for by the local authorities, so the Greater London Authority and TfL in London, and Mersey Travel as the combined authority up in Merseyside for Merseyrail. And at the bottom we have the open access operators. Eurostar connects us with low carbon high speed rail to the Netherlands, to Belgium, to France. Grand Central, which goes to exotic, but not quite as exotic as those to Bradford and Sunderland. Hull Trains, Heathrow Express serving the airport from Paddington, and Lumo, about to launch on 25th of October, low-cost services from King's Cross to Edinburgh and Morpeth, if you want to go there. So this is a flavour of some of the passenger operators that are on the rail network. Whether these will stay and these names will stick around, we will see. There'll be some changes in terms of simplicity. Franchises were initially a private venture where the private sector would go and take the revenue risk. That's a model that has struggled, which was basically put to bed by the COVID pandemic. The government stepped in to keep the franchises going, and now through rail reform, we'll be changing the model slightly, but we'll get to that a little bit later. But even more interesting is freight. Here we have a number of freight operators. Some are names you'll know, and some are names that you won't necessarily know. You've got the big players, DB, Freightliner, GB Rail Freight, Direct Rail Services, and some which are starting to make their way more in the industry, such as Victor Rail Freight Rail Operations Group, and you've got an idea of some of the main lines that they operate on. Freight is massively growing. We've got opportunities aplenty in the freight sector. We've got a huge opportunity for growth. Freight responded to the pandemic very well. We got back to 95 to 100% of pre-COVID levels within about 2 months of lockdown, about April and May of last year. And we have people banging on the doors to get more freight on rail as well. The passenger railways recovery is obviously a bit more complicated and a little bit slower, given the changes of working environments, but you can't send a container's worth of goods or 2,000 tons of aggregate via Zoom. And the freight railway looks a bit like this. We have the electric freight, although I won't mention that given the news today, and we have the Victus Class 66 capable of hauling 2,000 plus tons of aggregate or intermodal or aviation fuel or metals or whatever that may be. And there are more opportunities for freight going all the time. Express logistics is one of the areas that I've mentioned just before as well. So the modern freight scene is changing, it's growing, it's very exciting. But the passenger railway is also changing. Lots of new fleets and investment have come online in recent years. Transport Express have replaced all their fleets. They've got new shiny electrics and bimodes. Thameslink upgrade program, the Thameslink 2000 program was finished. It didn't necessarily finish in 2000. It kind of started then, and now we have the Thameslink Core, which has got automatic trains running through it, or will do soon, with massive capacity for huge numbers of people to move across London, which I'm sure will get busier again over time. And one of my favourite passenger train fleets is the Greater Anglia Flirts, which you can see demonstrating their lovely step-free access there with the little step-out board and the low-floor design, allowing level boarding between passenger and train, which is an absolute must, and a model definitely to be copied by the industry going forward, and Merseyrail soon to introduce their own electric variants for their services. So where is the railway going? Well, obviously that's for people much cleverer than me, but with apologies to my friend Gareth Dennis for nicking his graph, but here we can see that rail ridership is coming back. It's going to be causing lots of different questions about how do we get more people back? What does that look like? How does that interact with freight services? We need modal shift if we're going to hit our climate change targets. The climate change is driven much by the transport sector, which produces over 30% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions. 27% comes from the road. Railways are already very green, but they're not so green if we're still burning diesel fuel. And so therefore we need to have a very good think, and the rail reform is a perfect opportunity to do exactly that and balance more the needs of both the passenger and the freight railway. So I'm absolutely raw through that. I'm running 5 minutes ahead of schedule, which is very rare. So that is a quick canter through some of the history of the railway, and so I will happily field any questions which you may have. And if you would like, here's some essential reading, which I will highly recommend for anyone who's interested. Read for Danger. If you want to learn about the development of safety in the railway, I highly recommend you grab a copy of LTC Rolt's book. It's essential reading. Another essential reading is by Gerard Fines, I Tried to Run a Railway, which is such an important book and such an insight into how to run a railway. He got fired for publishing it. And also, of course, essential reading is the William Shapps Plan for Rail, if you want to know the kind of things the government are going to be doing and how the railway is going to change shape over the next 5-10 years, then definitely recommend reading through the William Shapps Plan for Rail and see what the future of rail holds for Great British Railways. So that is enough waffle for me. I will end it there. I'm going to close this. This might cause my screen to go a bit weird, so I will happily stop yabbering 5 minutes early and take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. We've had some really interesting questions from the audience. The first question for you comes from Jason Hodgson. Roughly, what is the current percentage split between freight and passenger travel?
Freight and passenger travel. If I am to, well, actually, I'm not quite sure. Is that in terms of mileage or usage, or? I appreciate
the question was literally as I read it out. What is the percentage split roughly? I assume in terms of trains running is my assumption, but Jason, feel free to add a question in the chat again to clarify, and we can always come back to that one.
In terms of the percentage of trains around the network, I don't have the exact figures in my head on that one, I'm afraid. But what I will say is that in terms of the volume of trains, number of trains run per day, there are certainly more passenger trains, even in the kind of post-COVID timetable, than there are freight trains that are running. In what I can say is that, like I kind of alluded to there with the usage figures, is that in terms of the pandemic and its response, the freight railway has reached 100%, and we're trying to almost run more than 100% of pre-COVID levels. And as I said, about May of last year, the usage levels got back to about 95% of pre-COVID. And in terms of the passenger railway, we know that we do know, obviously, that the travel patterns have changed, particularly London and the southeast, but we know that the leisure market is growing. We know that some operators are having to reinstate services because of the demand, and we know there's lots of complaints now coming in about crowding on some passenger services. So we know that passengers are always coming back, but the figures we're hearing is roughly 60 to 70%, with the trajectory increasing, and that's obviously, if there's no more lockdowns, that should keep growing. So we'll have somewhere near a full railway again, but it still does present challenges between marrying up the growth demand of passengers and the freight railway. I hope that answers your question.
Brilliant, thank you very much. The next question comes in from Sarah Ridley. and that was that Simon referred to open access operators as a subset of train operators. What does that mean?
That's a very good question. Yes, I completely glossed over that. So open access operators are different to franchise operators. Franchised operators were basically at privatisation, when the passenger railways broken up into all the little bits, these were the passenger services that were being operated from stations all over the country, that established passenger services that had run on existing lines. Open access operators come in a few forms. They basically, it's a catch-all term for either new entrants for running services between destinations that didn't exist before, or they kind of fit in services which don't quite fit in with the rest of the network. So the latter term captures Eurostar, because it doesn't really fit in with the rest of the network, because particularly now we've had the High Speed 1 fully open for St Pancras on the 14th of November 2007. I remember that because I was there. It's fairly separate. It runs on High Speed 1 infrastructure into the Channel Tunnel into France and so on and so forth. Heathrow Express is a separate operation, because it is basically paid for and organised by the Heathrow Airport Group, BAA, who pay for it, and it's therefore not a franchise service, and you have special fares, and by special I mean extremely expensive. But other open access operators basically are there to provide a service which other your main operators, your franchise operators, don't provide. So there aren't many direct services from London to Hull, or London to Sunderland, or Bradford, and there aren't many cheap, for example, options for travel between London and Edinburgh. And that's what open access operators in the main Grand Central Hull trains try and do, is find a niche without abstracting too much revenue from the main railway, and fill a gap in the market they think is there. That's basically what open access operators do.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Nafisa Nathani and asks, how can the freight industry better innovate and modernise?
Well, that's a very good question. So I think one of the exciting areas that we certainly have is about express logistics, and this is about particularly how to run trains a little bit faster. So that's why Rail Operations Group are converting electric multiple units, which are passenger units rated to go 100 miles an hour. And the reason for that is because we can slot them in between passenger trains much easier. However, a converted multiple unit, like an old 319 that used to do Thameslink trains, can't carry a shipping container, and it can't carry hundreds of tons of aggregate sand or stone to a construction site, for example, very easily. So then we try to optimize our network to run longer and heavier. So sometimes in terms of innovation, we can do things, for example, running jumbo trains. So jumbos is basically where you run 2 train lengths in one, and we try and find, for example, overnight gaps. So that means we have to challenge our maintenance teams to try and find the slots overnight where we can run these longer freight trains without disrupting the passenger railway, but making sure that we can get all the maintenance done and do that in a cost-effective way. And there are lots of plans to try and optimize signalling, and gauging is a big one as well. So sometimes you don't have to do something necessarily very clever and whizzy. You can simply do things like, for example, provide the capacity by improving infrastructure, make it bigger, make it stronger, allow longer and heavier trains to run. And sometimes you could do things like, for example, we have detectors to ensure that wagon wheels are in good condition and they're not breaking or breaking rails, or that our rails are in good condition. And also you can have tracking systems so customers can better able to track their consignments, and all these types of systems which are all coming in to modernise how we move freight around the country and better serve our customers, and we can provide a better railway for them.
Thank you. The next question comes in from Jake Savage. What is your opinion on the recent news regarding Fox utilising diesel units even when operating on fully electrified routes due to the high and increasing electricity costs? And what can and should the industry do, and what should the government do, especially in the short term?
Oh, that's a very good question. It's been very difficult because obviously, I mean, you know, we've got COP26 is around the corner, and it's a little bit difficult to be saying that we're at the forefront of decarbonisation when we are kind of parking up our electric fleets of locos and replace them with diesels. It has to be a balance between certain things. The reason that there can be cost pressures on freight operators is because there are so many upfront costs in running a freight train that sometimes the profit margins for freight operators can be very tight, and that means that any shocks in costs can be very difficult to handle. And we've seen this with things like coal, we've seen these things with like biomass, and those shocks are very difficult for any industry, not just the rail industry, to deal with. It's not just happening in Britain. Energy prices across Europe are also affected. Freightliner Poland are standing down some of their electric locos in Poland for a similar reason. So it's not just happening in Britain. In terms of a solution forward, well, I think it's a case of the government and the freight operators are probably going to have to sit down and work out how they want to proceed. If the government wants to carry on with its decarbonisation agenda and bolster the railway in terms of getting the current electric fleets and more electric trains going, then they might have to take steps. And freight operators might have to be a bit braver about how they go about ensuring that the most optimal traction is running. But I probably couldn't say more than that, I'd say, at this stage.
Brilliant, thank you. This next question comes from, again, Nafisa Nathani. You've asked some really good questions. The next one is, do you think the rail freight sector could capitalise a lot more than it is currently, given the HGV lorry shortage?
In short, yes. But the thing is that the rail freight sector, it takes a little bit of time in order to get all your ducks in a line, because you have to organise a whole set of things to happen to get your supply chain in the right place, to get your terminals in the right place, to get sets of wagons, locomotives, crew diagrams, bids, paths, and make sure that you can run that train, run that flow, that everything's in the right place. Particularly if it's somewhere like a new terminal where trains haven't run in many years, it can take a little bit of time getting that over the line. So where perhaps a more fleet-footed road haulage operator might be able to summon up, maybe before the HGV driver crisis, might be able to summon up a driver and a truck and a customer on both ends and serve that and get that going quite quickly. There's a few more steps you have to go through to get that on rail, but once you've nurtured that and gone through that process and got it going, and you've started operating enough to get those profit margins going, get over your operating costs, then you can find that those flows get established and they will stick around. So it takes a little bit longer to get the flows going on the railway scene, and by longer I just mean it might take a couple of months rather than a few weeks that you might find in the road sector. But yes, but we have to remember that what we're ultimately aiming for as a freight sector more widely is that we have to work in tandem, in partnership with our road haulage colleagues, because at the end of the day, as much as we'd love to have railway lines running into every supermarket in the country, we can't do that. So there has to be an HGV driver at some end of the scale. So if we can optimize the freight sector where railway does the long difficult bit and the road bit comes in and does the last mile, then that's perfect. It puts less pressure on both industries and both sides of the both modes of transport will be offering their best abilities, and everyone's a winner. But it takes a little bit of time to get that going, but it's something we are most certainly doing. Can I just say as well, before I take the next question, that I didn't mean this to become all about freight, I promise.
That's all right. So the next question I've got is from Jason Hodgson again. With the change from steam to diesel and now to electrification, how much of the infrastructure is electrified, and do we have a goal to increase this? Alongside this, is there a movement to move the rolling stock to electrical traction?
Excellent question. So currently around 42%, if I've got that right, of our Britain's railway network is electrified. Now, that's great, but it doesn't compare so well, for example, to other countries. In Europe in general, the average is they have about 60% of their networks electrified. Germany is currently engaging in what we call the Holy Grail, the rolling program of electrification, which is where they are just basically electrifying lines on a continual basis all across the country in priority order, do the most important ones first and just kind of keep it going. we definitely need to electrify our railway lines. I did say before that we can actually probably run our trains all with diesel, and the fact that we have the advantage of rail is that it's a steel wheel and steel rail. It's super efficient. We can move large amounts of people and things very fast and very efficiently. And we could have all our trains running with diesel, and it would still be much more efficient than, say, road, and certainly more efficient than aviation. However, we shouldn't rest on our laurels. Industries are changing. Aviation and road sectors are talking about hydrogen and batteries and all this kind of stuff, and the railways therefore need to be at the forefront of the decarbonisation and the greening of our economy. So we definitely need to be putting in more electrification. We need to be having a program based, like the Germans are doing now, a program of rolling electrification, and where I certainly think that myself and my colleagues would be knocking on the door to government is saying, look, we've got quick, easy wins. The London Gateway Port, which is kind of between Tilbury and Southend, is served by a 2-mile branch line off the existing electrified network. Electrify it. There's a small gap of railway between Acton and Willesden, which is unelectrified. Electrify it. We can start running through trains, because the thing is that freight doesn't respect the regional boundaries or the passenger train boundaries. So there's lots of quick wins we could start doing, which could very quickly start getting more freight on rail. Because one of the other things you could do is you could run electric loco and then take it off and put a diesel on. But then you're losing time, you're losing money, it's a waste of resources. And remember, freight's all about being efficient. So we need more electrification, and the more we start doing that, the more we can improve our railways' carbon decarbonisation output, make it more low carbon, and the passenger railway will benefit off the back of it as well. So lead from freight is what I'd say.
Brilliant, thank you. Our next question comes from Richard Tipper. What do you think we can do to entice more passengers back to the railway?
Well, that is a good question. Well, I think one of the things is that we know that commuting is different now. And to be controversial, that's not a bad thing, because when I worked at Crossrail 5 years ago, we were talking then, in the heady days before the COVID became a thing, we were talking about the fact that we were talking about peak tube. And that was this idea that the London transport network would be completely full in the morning peak, and particularly the high peak, which is kind of 8:30 to 9:30. Everyone's trying to get into the office at the same time, and I realised that we're basically trying to maximise capacity on the railway network for 1 hour of a weekday, so 5 days a week, so not even every single day of the year. And is that the best utilisation of resources? Is that the best way to spend money? Is to have this infrastructure which is used for 1 hour of a weekday, and then it doesn't do much else the rest of the day, kind of thing. So in fact, if we have fewer people traveling in totality at that time, but we have more people spread throughout the day, whether they're doing remote working, whether they're doing business travel, whether they're doing leisure travel, then that's actually a good thing for the railway. And it means that we can run the railway reliably. It means we can run the railway more reliably for passengers and for freight operators, and we can get the balance of paths that we need. We can run at the right capacity, and therefore we can attract passengers back to rail if we run a good, reliable, comfortable service. That does mean we're going to have to think about fares. It does mean we're going to have to think about the kind of customer service we offer to passengers on passenger services. And it also means we're going to have to think about the kind of train interiors that we have, because one of the things that trains have been competing with for a long time is the express buses, or even the private car. You see a car seat, it's plush and it's comfortable, and there's been lots of criticism of modern train interiors. But I think the industry is starting to catch on. The East Midlands Railway Aurora fleet, the new bi-modes, are going to be brought into service, I think, in 2 years' time. They're being designed with a passenger in mind, which hasn't necessarily been done so much before. So those are the types of things that the industry and government are going to have to think about if they're going to attract passengers back to rail.
Thank you. I'm afraid, unfortunately, we've only got time for one more question, and that question comes from Louisa Connolly, which is, will we achieve a modal shift at our current passenger fares and freight rates? Final question from Louisa. Thank
you, Louisa. Will we achieve modal shift? Well, we will do, because we are doing, because what's happening at the moment is that our roads are completely chock-a-block. because a lot of people still aren't returning to public transport. COVID, we saw that road usage returned to 100% of pre-COVID use and more very, very quickly. So we know there's plenty of people traveling around. The idea that people don't travel is not really the case. So people are traveling. Modal shift is only going to really happen if we have the right incentives in place. So as I said, if we make the railway reliable and affordable, then it's definitely a case that we can do that. One of the major ways we can do that, for example, is by providing more capacity on the network and more resilience. We should be using the classic networks to its advantage, which, you know, the classic networks are a bit older, a bit more constrained in urban and rural environments. So we should be using the classic networks to run local, regional and freight services. And we should be, for example, putting our fastest trains onto new infrastructure like High Speed 2. And that is why we're building High Speed 2, phases 1, phase 2A, 2B up to Manchester and Wigan is coming along. Phase 2 East, there's some noises coming out about the fact that that might be cancelled or postponed, or maybe it will happen and be downgraded. We don't know yet. We'll find out when the integrated rail plan comes out, which should be soon. But the thing is that if we can get the fastest trains off the current network, it will allow better local, regional and freight services. It will allow, again, for a more reliable service. And at the end of the day, if we're not going to have the masses of peak travellers travelling again, if we're going to have more leisure and discretionary travellers, then we are, as an industry, we are going to have a very serious look at how we price our railways and how we do our fares, because we have to obviously account for our costs, but we also have to account for the fact that we have wider social and economic benefits, and that counts for freight as well, in terms of, you know, removing lorries from the roads and all the economic and environmental and social benefits thereof. But we have to have a think about what kind of passengers are going to go on. And at the end of the day, I speak to a lot of people who are not in the industry, and they find the railways off-puttingly expensive. So perhaps if we thought a little bit more about that, we could incentivize more people to go by not just offering a better service and more comfortable trains, but also by looking at fares reform, which is probably something that's going to be looked at by Great British Railways. So of course I'm urging the current state of play and the history of, but there's definitely room for improvement. But it's about how we do that to make sure that it's not done in a way that is not disadvantageous to the taxpayer. And means that the industry can at least, you know, cover its costs and be responsible with taxpayers' money. But conscious of time, so I'll have to leave that there. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you to the audience for asking such fantastic plethora of questions. It was very difficult to choose from. And now that brings an end to our Q&A section for Simon. Jacob, if you'd like to take over, please. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yes, Simon, thank you very much for that. It was really good, really informative, and I'm going to hand straight over to Michael Clark. So I'll let Michael introduce himself, and Michael, just give me a heads up when you want your slides moving on, and I'll do that for you. Thank you.
Great. Can you hear me? Is that all right?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you. I'll get started then. Look, that was fantastic. Thank you very much, Simon. I really enjoyed that. It's always good to have the history to understand, as you said, I think during that presentation, where we've come from and what we are. So brilliant. But my plea now is let's not get obsessed with it. I tried in vain when we were writing the white paper not to have Victorians and the Victorian Railway mentioned at all. And that's just to explain, not because I'm disinterested. I'm actually a historian by education. I'm very interested in it, but I worry at times in Britain and in industries, the looking back and the nostalgia can overtake the looking forward. And I really want to talk about the future of rail, how we're going to make it the heart of the UK transport system, support economic growth and decarbonisation as we come out of COVID. If you read the William Shapps Plan for Rail, you'll see I lost that fight, but there we are. And I think probably rightly so, as Simon has showed, you've got to connect to your past so that you can get the right future. But I just want to say it's really awesome though to get invited here to come and welcome you to rail, because you're the people that will be building that future and the people shaping it. And this transformation needs your support, needs your action, and it won't work without you. So no pressure on you at all, but I thought I'd make that clear at the start of what my expectations are. And I generally believe actually we've got a generational opportunity here to improve the railway. let's not pretend that it's going to be quite difficult. It's going to take lots of us to work together in new ways and make the best of this poor financial context. So I'm excited, but I'm realistic. And I hope those kind of echo your feelings as you're joining the industry as well. You can see the slide in front of you there. I should probably confess that I stole these slides. They are from the DFT. They're not mine. But that's a good sign of the collaboration we have with the department as we go forward, and that will become apparent as to why I've done it as I go through this. But I probably should, as Jacob invited me to, explain who I am and who does what in this world of rail transformation as we get into the talk today, and then tell you what I'm going to talk about. But thanks to Jacob, Paul, Bonnie, and Eric, and Mark for people making this possible in the first place. I think it's a really good idea, a really good initiative, and I'm very pleased to be taking part. But just on me, so I am Michael Clark. My current job title is slightly updated from the one Jacob had. We're set up mode and we're moving so quickly. So I'm Director for Strategy and Transformation in the Great British Railways transition team. I am on secondment from the Department for Transport. I am actually a civil servant by employment, but I've been doing this for the last 14 months embedded in Network Rail and then the transition team. And I'll talk a little bit about more what that means, so it hopefully makes sense throughout this presentation. My time in rail is pretty recent. I only started doing it at the Williams Review, so that was from September 2018. It will become very apparent quickly, especially after Simon's talk, that I am not a rail expert by any sense. So my background is for a range of civil service jobs. I worked in the Treasury on such things as money laundering and the Eurozone. I've worked in the Foreign Office on armaments control. I've worked on climate change in what was DEC, and I was working for several years on aviation policy in the Department for Transport before I got into rail. But my first, I don't know if it's coincidence or not, but my first job in government was working for the Eddington Transport Study, which looked at the economics of transport and how it could support the UK, which was run by Rod Eddington, another former British Airways boss. So I'm developing an interesting habit of working on reviews, British Airways bosses on transport issues. But it is fun, and they were both very good people to work for. But what does that mean in terms of this discussion? It means I'm pretty good at public policy and strategy and pretty useless at detailed operational issues and wider railway knowledge. So I hope Simon sticks around, because if you have as good and detailed questions on certain things as you did for his talk, I might have to cross-reference if he doesn't mind. So with your expectations managed, what we'll be getting into in this discussion, I should probably explain the first slide. Is this the first slide? On what the Rail Transformation Programme is. It is a department-led major government project, and it oversees all aspects of the transformation coming out of the William Shapps Plan for Rail for the government. I'll explain more about all of that later, including what the Great British Railways Transition Team does in that and what I do. But it's probably time I got into what we're doing today. I was going to, hopefully you'll be okay with me talking through the William Shapps Plan for Rail. I was head of the Secretariat under Keith there, how we got it, what it says, what it does, and then we'll get through those next steps on transformation, and in particular onto GBR. But I'll have to wind back a little bit to 2018 when all this rail reform started first, if that's okay. I'm just going to check the slide. Can I have the next slide, please? Brilliant. So I like to call this the kind of problem and opportunity slide, drawn from the review in a bit of a context of rail at the beginning of and slightly throughout, so pre-COVID on the review. I'll let the slide for two reasons. I think on the right you get a sense of the vital role that railways play in British life, connecting people, as you heard from Simon, a lot of low carbon contribution to travel and moving goods around the economy. And on the left hand side you've got the reasons that it, despite those things that it was doing for the nation, the reasons that it was in the headlines, it was always a subject of bulging MPs' letter bags, and that was that the passage satisfaction trends were going south for various different reasons, as you can see on the slide there. punctuality, 1 out of 3 trains being late, is not great for any industry if that's their statistic. But there was a lot about the interior, as we heard in the last thing, so comfort, accessibility, and it meant that rail was pretty much constantly in the media and in Parliament for the wrong reasons rather than the right reasons. Just to take a small deviation at the start, I might do this occasionally, it's an opportunity to actually muse and ask you questions and do come back on this or not. So there was a debate during the review, and there's a debate now. Simon might know that it's been a debate for decades about whether you use the term passengers or customers as the appropriate term. And we use passengers for the review, and that's still the generally preferred DfT term. And in fact, actually, if you poll, or the last time I understood that people were polled on this, they prefer to see themselves in the main, about 3/4 of them, I think, as passengers, and sometimes get annoyed if you refer to them as customers. But actually, in the Great British Railways transition team, we have switched to using the term customer. And we've done that because I think it's an important mindset shift for ourselves. Quite a few talks use the term customer, and there's evidence coming through from them that actually changes the kind of service ethos that staff have when they go about their jobs. It can support, it's a driver of better customer satisfaction and brings a more business-like approach to that organisation's way of dealing with customers. Also, I think touched on in the last presentation, the post-COVID world with car travel up, public health fears of rail more than other modes of transport, options not to travel because you can work at home massively increased. I do think there's another reason that we should really take stock. There's choice now, to travel by other modes, to travel, not to travel, and I think that's where we're looking at something as a customer and trying to entice them rather than just a passenger who is travelling because they have to, is quite useful. I think fundamentally for us as well that customer makes you think more broadly. So I never like really saying and freight, and freight, there's passengers, oh yeah, and freight. So customers kind of integrates them and puts them at the heart of it as well from the get-go, as it should. It's even wider, like people that engage and interact with the railway estate, whether they shop at a station, whether they use a car park, or even potential customers. So I just wanted to mention that as an interesting debate I've had over these past couple of years on the review as someone new to it. The other thing I wanted to note with this, and before we get started to the meat of it, is that it's not to get too negative about the railway. It's very easy to slip into a potentially negative mindset, especially when you're reviewing it and when what's gone wrong and what needs to improve. It all sounds implicitly negative, and it's very human. If a passenger we found has 10 good journeys and 1 bad one, it's the bad one they remember and the bad one that influences their behaviour, and it's the bad one that they moan to their friends all about. And quite rightly, you should pay for a service, you should get a good service, so the bad should be the exceptional. But I think we've got to be careful not to obsess with the negative. Let's not be shy. There's a lot of improvement necessary. That's why we're here. But we shouldn't lose what is done well. Rail is full of skilled and devoted people. And, it's proved that very recently during the pandemic, what a vital role it can play in supporting communities, regions, and the nation. And it's relied upon by millions of people. I think, as you got from Simon's talk as well, it's got a special place, I think, in the nation's psyche. Which is another reason why it's very sensitive if it goes wrong. But it also holds up well in a lot of international comparisons. So I think I'm just saying, look, you'll hear a lot about reform and change, and that's rightly so. But actually, there's a lot of positives that we need to learn from and build on and be crystal clear when a change is needed. Okay, can we get the next slide, please? Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to spend a bit more time on the earlier slides, and then I'll speed up, I promise, as we go through, and I'll try and keep an eye on the time. So running the review was an interesting balancing act, just to give you a sense of how we got here. We needed the independence of thought and understanding, but you needed to be aware it was done for a particular purpose by a particular government. I thought DfT managed that well. They brought in people like me and Keith that had no knowledge of rail for an outside view, but then embedded a lot of rail experts in the team. It was multidisciplinary with Treasury, Network Rail, business, and ORR embeds. So it was really a kind of attempt to take a wide view of it. It was very manic. We set up with 4 people. We launched with 4 people, so we were growing the team, planning the work, and talking to everyone at the same time. recommend that, but you know, it is what it is. So well, the first bit was, you know, worth going back if you're particularly interested in this and how it was shaped, to look at, we worked very early on to get some speeches out and some position papers, you know, the case for rail, facts about rail in the UK, country comparisons, options on future tech, just to try and start framing the debate and getting some feedback, and did some passenger research as well. You know, we wanted this to be well evidenced and well listened. And this helped us brigade the work around 5 significant areas: a new passenger offer, new commercial model, a simpler industry structure, retail revolution, and a workforce modernisation. And I mentioned that because you'll see, you can compare to what came out of the actual white paper. The last thing I'll note on this is that Keith is a really great person to work with. We're very lucky. You know, he listens, he's very strategic, he brought everyone with him, he really wants to encourage the team and engage, and I think that really set the tone and helped the review be successful. While we were running the review, so the 2018 timetable disaster was the immediate prompt, where a series of upgrades to infrastructure, which would then allow more services to run, which would require more drivers and personnel to do across a series of TOCs and regions, didn't happen, largely because none of those bits were talking to each other, and they didn't realise that they couldn't bring through the training of the drivers on time to run the services. There was also overrunning engineering works, wouldn't allow it to happen where it was possible, because the different actors in the system that were set out in the previous speech, no one had the oversight of them, and it was found out too late, and then it was a massive disaster for passengers involved and had huge financial and reputational impacts on the railway. There was general acceptance, though. That was the catalyst. There was general acceptance, I think, that change was needed in rail increasingly after that. The model had been tinkered with and patched over for decades, you know, with rising passenger numbers hiding many of the challenges. 2005, the Strategic Rail Authority model ended and was absorbed back into the department, putting franchising very close to government. They were planning to move it back out again, but there was in 2012 there was a disastrous procurement failure on the west coast, and the DfT got sued, and that put an end to moving it out, and got ever more, you know, controlled by ministers who didn't want this. Didn't want a fiasco and wasted public money again, but that led to greater specificity and requirements being put in franchises from the centre, and this reduced operators' ability to take risk and drive revenue. And toward the late 2010s, the market for franchises was shrinking. You know, there were more failures of operators, more direct awards because they couldn't get franchises away. The Rail Delivery Group, the RDG, had been created at McNulty Review, but was unable, as the rest of the system didn't change around it, unable really to lead the railway as was envisaged, and just became did a lot of valuable work. Wasn't another interface that could delay things and confuse accountability. Network Rail's control period 5, their 5-year spending period, was undeliverable and over budget, and had to be reviewed and moved around at cost, and again, disappointment to some of the schemes that had been expected, and knock-on impacts for those services that had been planned on them. So all parts of the system were creaking. And 2018 threw this into stark relief. It was high time for a good review. And there are 2 notable things about Williams that we tried to do differently. I think we succeeded. And one was that it was a hybrid review. What I mean by that is that it was independently chaired by Keith Williams, but it was a government review. It benefited from the independence of his thought and thinking, but it then became a white paper. So normally you'd have an independent review, would produce a wonderful tome with great thoughts. A couple of months would go by, government would then produce a response of bits they liked, they didn't like, you know, and then start enacting it in policy a bit later. So if they got to white paper, if it was needed. So we wanted to kind of shortcut that painful process and ensure that whatever we did recommend kind of got to be government policy. And I think that overall that caused some delicate balancing acts in the final few months of trying to work out what we were going to say, but overall it worked really well. And I think you can see that we're now motoring on rather than having that back and forth. The other thing that was really useful was that the review was comprehensive. So rather than a lot of the previous reviews that looked at niche or particular issues such as how do you make the railway more efficient or what went wrong with that franchise competition, we were described as root and branch and had the permission to look at anything, which I think was the important difference. So Keith, you can see on the slide there, quickly diagnosed 6 main problems with the railway that he wanted his review to look at and tackle. I'll just pass over them. One is that the railway loses sight of its customers. It wasn't right. We found it wasn't running the interests of its passengers anymore. It was kind of fragmented and governed more by complex legal contracts, and people had to were incentivized to look at what what they had to do to fulfill that contract or complete that project, rather than what was the best option for the customer. And that was coming through in those satisfaction ratings earlier. We thought it was missing opportunities to meet the needs of the communities it serves. People love the fact that rail connects them to different places. They love the fact it can boost their towns and cities. But we didn't find very consistent and very good ways of how cities could input their priorities into the railway, and the railway could articulate that. And that meant you just got large asks of bigger railway, more services or more connections that weren't necessarily the right transport answer or the economic answer for that. But similarly, there was no way of inputting that and working that through with the railway to get good local collaboration on initiatives. It was fragmented and its accountability is not always clear. So this is a big one. You know, for example, passengers in our research found it very difficult to engage with the system, especially if something was going wrong. They were getting inconsistent and minimal communication. They didn't know who they could ask for help. Was it the TOC? Was it the station? If it was a Network Rail owned station, was it Network Rail the problem? You know, did it come back to government? You know, it was unclear who was in charge on many issues, and in fact, quite a few people have an interest, you know, in various different issues. And in fact, we found a lot of issues only really came together on the desk of the Secretary of State. That was the only place that actually you could get into everything and oversee everything, which can't be right. And this fragmentation adds lots of cost, inefficiency, and interface into the system, which is unnecessary and exposes you to systems risk like May 18, as we discussed. Lack of sector direction is another consequence of that. There's no long-term and consistent direction for the sector. Various organisations were pursuing different options at different times across different bits of the network. Again, that confuses passengers. Again, it's inefficient. No one has the right levers to trade off between the competing demands on the railway, and so they were often traded off either by default or local negotiations, you know, which is not the right. It's a fix rather than the right outcome. It wasn't productive and tackling its long-term costs. I mean, the railway wasn't a commercially viable business before COVID. It's not now. It's supported by considerable taxpayer funding, and as a consequence, required to, let's not forget, undertake considerable public kind of activity and support. We've talked about the dwindling market that there was then for franchise competitions in investment. Financial incentives on the franchisees weren't right to optimise network level outcomes, and could lead to perverse outcomes and lack of efficiency. Infrastructure costs were inflated at times, you know, and didn't bear international comparisons. Workforce productivity had not increased in parallel with wage increases. Lastly, you know, all of this meant, unsurprisingly, the railway struggled to innovate and adapt. I mean, data, for example, split across multiple franchises, organisations and retailers, and no one has a clear customer view that they can then use to design and market new products. You can't roll out any design on new market products very easily or quickly or cheaply across the whole network, so that everyone gets a consistent offer and you get the return very quickly and commercialise it. Shorter term franchises don't incentivise long-term innovation or investment in the way they were set up, and employment practices vary significantly across the industry and are difficult to change and flex to focus on different areas of customer service or new skills that come out. So with these quite stark problems, Williams wanted to give a really strong mandate for industry reform, which we were all collectively determined to respond to at pace. Could I get the next slide, please? Thank you. The timetable here doesn't have on it some of the quite essentially the difficult political events that also buffeted us. So we were set up to finish in about a year. We got to kind of end of 19, there were elections. We got to the beginning of 20, and there was Brexit, and then we got to March, and there was COVID. Now, honestly, there were times when I did think the review might not get published, but we did, which was great. And one of the reasons for, I think, the review enduring and getting through those difficulties was the engagement that Williams and the team did. And we all made a real effort to listen to people in the railway and on the railway and around the railway, really, and build a consensus. And we consulted directly and through a call for evidence over 700 people and groups, and did regional tours and call for evidence. And it was really important for us to be engaged. I think I realised with a bit of hindsight, actually, it was a bit of a whirlwind at the time. But that led to a consensus that was hard to ignore for change. and also meant that it increased the likelihood of success and was an attractive thing to do for people involved. I think, actually, being honest, we've let it go since. It's been a problem since, with the instability of the context around COVID impacts. The programme has become a bit insular. It's reviewed itself, not necessarily, and preparations for launch kept getting delayed. Whilst we also tried to develop an implementation approach. So I think we need to correct that very quickly. It's another reason I'm very pleased to be here today. But there was a need, let's be honest, to reassess after COVID, as Simon said, quite fundamentally overnight changed how the railway was working. But the uncertain demand and the economic context as well would need to be borne in mind. But the changes in the way railway was went in the direction of Williams generally as we read through this. Emergency support to operators and the new contracts gave government the revenue risk and made that they could control everything relatively directly, which is not the model, but it allowed you to reset and build toward the model in an easier way, I think. So, right, can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. I don't really like the slide, so apologies for this. But it gives you a sense, if you haven't read it, of the main areas that the white paper, the Williams Shafts Plan for Rail covers. And there was a white paper expansion, as you may have noticed from what I said earlier. We were concentrating on the review after COVID, more explicit inclusion, which I'm very pleased about, of decarbonisation, of supply chain and innovation, and a bigger focus on digital and data. Were also added in there, so that the white paper actually covered the widest possible ground it could, and wider than review, kind of crowned it in almost all of rail, which I think is really positive, and again a good basis for us to move forward. I'll just mention before I get into some of the reforms that the review tested a lot of options, so it very much wasn't what you see here as the first thing we came to in the first couple of the months of the review. Here we tested a lot of commercial and structural models to get to this point. So on the commercial model, for example, we looked at free market scenarios, we looked at regulated utility scenarios, we looked at contracted, and we even looked at nationalised and directly operated. And then under the contracted, again, there are lots of options we considered, kind of gross cost contracts, highly specified, loosely specified, some mixture of the two. And similarly with the structure, we looked at whether infrastructure managers should be in or out of a body, what combinations of regions and centre there might be. We tried remapping regions around customer markets and flows and financial flows and various other ways of remapping it. We'll get to. So it was based on quite some very fun and some quite extensive work to get the right answer. But if we go to the next slide, we'll get into what the answer was. And here's me suggesting it's right, but that's my own. That's my own perspective, of course. So this is what Williams did recommend. There were 62 outcomes set out in the white paper, but grouped into these 10 overarching ones by the programme on the next slides, and I'll spend some time on the next two slides running through these. I mean, overall, Williams' model was aiming for an efficient commercial railway, where whole industry decisions are taken as low down in the value chain as possible, as many at regional and local level as possible, and that it's clear where all responsibilities lie. We were also keen to have a system that's flexible, designed to adjust depending on the market and the cycle of demand. I think that's an important point that I think Simon helpfully picked up. We found the current system unable to evolve well and flex, and we wanted to change that. And against the problem statement, it really does try and break down today's silos, where a large ALB like Network Rail is incentivised to concentrate on infrastructure, talks for short-term operations that chase revenue, and ministers attempt to set funding strategy, and the ORCs to regulate and decide who has access to the network on some outdated duties, if I'm honest. So let's get into some of these recommendations. Keith always started with passengers. Why is the railway there? Not to enjoy restructuring itself, but to serve its customers, and that was always his go-to, and a good mantra, I think, for the cultural change we want to drive. Sorry. On top of that, I've talked about the reasons why previously. A lot of people try to serve customers, a lot of good. I'm not saying that they don't, but all the incentives are aligned to them to look to their projects or look to their bottom line, as opposed to just to think what the customer or the passenger wants. All rational behaviours given the incentives, fundamentally that needs to be changed. I mean, the incentives need to become customer focused. And Williams included a lot of stuff on how that, what customers wanted better that we would try and aim for in that system: consistent communication, greater information, one team approach in the railway, proper accessibility, better digital offers. These are set out in the white paper. I won't go into them here. Fares ticketing retail reform was a key part of that. The idea of needing to, rail is in retail terms quite years behind other modes, really hampered by the fragmentation. It needs to be modernised and made simple for the customer. It needs to kind of look at frictionless and end-to-end journeys as other modes are. Simpler industry structure, a major outcome to facilitate the others, not a goal in itself, I should be clear on. And the recommendation here was to establish Great British Railways, an integrated organisation combining track and train, and that allows it to act as what is called the guiding mind. So that body that can take a strategic oversight of what is going on in the railway, to look at system risks, to look at the optimisation of the network, and to undertake a range of whole industry activities. And the white paper talked about several of those activities. It talked about a 30-year strategy, or whole industry strategic plan, known colloquially as the WISP, which is to look at to help you trade off transparently over a long period of time what you want out of the railway with the amount of support that it can get from the public and the private sector. So taking what government's priorities, how do we trade those off? How do you decide between passengers and freight and regional and local priorities in a way that doesn't just become a kind of wish list and an ask, but is a sensible and clear trade-off that everyone can buy into, helps the supply chain, and sets a course, long-term course for the railway. Of course, that needs to be organic, it needs to evolve, but it needs to be done in a kind of planned, transparent way as we go forward. Whole industry financial management and having a profit and loss for the whole railway was very important to Williams at the moment. Costs are scattered around the different places. It's very difficult to get a sense of where the real cost drivers in the railway are in total. It's very hard even then to get a sense of where they interact with where the revenue generation is, and what would happen if you change bits to one and the consequences for the other. No one has real sight of that yet. It is all compartmentalised, and that needs to change so that you can run railway in the most efficient way possible. And data was another big one that we've already mentioned that needs to come together and work for the whole industry and all of its customers in the same way. So the idea of how Great British Railways will be constructed, it will combine what is most of DfT's rail group now, that does the franchising authority for England and Wales, or most of England, with Network Rail's infrastructure management responsibilities, bringing track and train together. That requires consequent changes to other industry players too. So the Office of Rail and Road will become, still remain the regulator, but it will lose its ability to determine access to the network, and will become a kind of monitoring and accountability function to look at whether GBR and other infrastructure providers are undertaking the tasks set to them fairly, become an appeals body for those who think it's not, and advise the Secretary of State still on the funding determination for the railway. Transport focus, it was recommended would become a kind of souped up passenger champion, not one that just says, wow, look, Tesla have decided that they're going to do this with their customers, we should do that in the railway. But what within the context of the goals set for the railway and the funding available from passengers and government, actually that customer service is slippery. You made commitments on that, it's not right. Actually, why don't you think about doing this if you have that money? So that kind of supportive voice and continuous voice for the passenger. And the rail delivery group had a split function going forward. Its services that it performs for the old ATOC schemes, so for the industry, such as the National Rail Inquiries website, and some of its there's a lot of back office functions to meet revenue around the system, would move into Great British Railways, and its advocacy would be based in a new trade body for operators. So a big part of all this change, the desire to clarify accountabilities, to ensure that any organisation accountable for something also had the levers of responsibility to act on that accountability, so they could follow through, and that was transparently done and openly monitored. As part of that, the idea was also that there was a clearer relationship with government. On one hand, we wanted that step removed, so Great British Railways, I'll call it GBR from here on in, GBR could more efficiently run an operational railway, but on the other hand, more clearly delivering against government set priorities and not looking to legal duties and contracts and that. Commercial model we've touched on has also changed in line with this. Keith was ownership neutral. There's a lot of debate, as you can imagine, when we talk to politicians about public or about private. Keith was ownership neutral, designed a model that could be shifted either way, more or less, but came up with one which we thought worked in the current kind of construct of the railway and which functioned best. It reorients contracts from revenue incentivized to performance incentivized, and potentially even kind of adversarial to more collaborative relationships with infrastructure and other operators. The white paper starts with the line on the need to get the trains to run on time. I think that shows the emphasis that government is now putting on that performance reliability. It is very important going back to flexibility, that we're firmly no one size fits all here. There is inbuilt flexibility. Rail serves different markets in different places, and the passenger service contracts, PSCs as they're called, the new contracts, are designed to accommodate that. GBR is accountable for revenue, timetable, and service specification the customer offer as the basis of these contracts and passes cost over. But it can flexibly determine how it delivers those functions with operators to get the best results for local markets and routes. And in doing this, it was the aim of the review actually explicitly to widen the potential pool of market operators who would participate. And exciting off the press news, if you haven't noticed it already, I think sign of progress that today the department actually issued the first prior information notice, or PIN, and a preview documentation for their PSC market engagement, which means they're notifying the market to get ready. The procurement is coming. Next slide, please. Brilliant. Importance of financial sustainability we've highlighted before. Rail is comparatively generously supported by customers and taxpayers and has been for many years. Don't think we can assume that will continue. I think it links to a lot of the recommendations on this page. Project Speed, about how you can, up in the top right, it's insight into how collaboration can occur across organisations. Working, in this case, Network Rail and the department, on how they had a simple slogan, I think, and challenged themselves to change the way things got done and why, it becoming more outcome and process focused. And their slogan, I think, was half the time and slash the costs of projects. And they worked together really closely to come up with new ways of doing that. We've talked about reform of people working in rail. There's a point on culture generally, that get more collaborative rather than adversarial railway. It starts with people, ensuring that they're incentivized to work in the right ways across the system. Part of that is working hard to expand the diversity of people in rail, to expand the experiences and viewpoints that exist, to add fresh thinking to current expertise. If we want outcomes to be different on the railway, we've got to operate differently to get them, I think. Just linked to that, something else worth pointing out, I think, is Williams explicit in looking at the railway as a commercial business operated in the public interest. Try and square that circle. So gone is the privatisation concept of an on-rail competition to drive outcomes, and here you have a strategic guiding mind operating the railways commercially to try and also deliver public good. And that allows you, I think, to step back and consider all railway matters, and here that's how we would like to drive big issues like decarbonisation systematically across the network, and also consider how you might devolve and interact with local partners across the network as well as serving your customers. So on that point of local control, pushing decisions down to the lowest level. So white paper is very clear. You know, the idea is not to create a big monolith when putting all these functions together. It still needs to push it down very hard. You know, the work that's been going on to put passengers first in Network Rail to push more down into the regions, something we want to build upon and accelerate as is sensible, notwithstanding my talk earlier of needing to take a systems and network-wide approach for certain functions. But the idea of subsidiarity is very strong in Williams, and there was a lot of desire we got from localities to work better with the railway, and I think GBR, I think, as one voice, hopefully located very low down and close to those localities, we should, through a series of strategic partnerships, be able to enable that better. and the department's doing more work on what that might mean at the moment. Freight, saving the best to last, because we've got a good billing in the last talk, was something that was very keen on actually having a national consideration for once and getting a one accountable place at the centre of the network, because it likes to run all across the country and not have to hit different barriers and standards and regions, and it wanted a kind of seat at the top table. So Williams agreed with this and advocated a strategic freight unit that would ensure top down the freight got due priority and consideration when railway was being considered and timetables and planning was being discussed, and there was also consideration going on as to whether, as there is in Scotland, there's a rail freight growth target that's set. Next slide, please. Okay, I am going to have to speed up as I appreciate I'm running. Sorry, I've only got 3 minutes, so I can take another 3. I won't dwell on this much here. Simon flashed up the before. This is just to show you the after, the attempt to look more simplified and remove interfaces. The Williams Review didn't actively look at safety and security, A, because it's working quite well, and B, you don't want to disturb those vital factors on the railway whilst you're transforming everything else. You want people to still concentrate them and know that they're important. But B, so, if you do transform the railway, you then do have to consider and do afterwards to safety and security organisations and mechanisms you have a right. So it committed to a subsequent review, safety culture, and the organisations and systems responsible for it. So that will come down the line. I'll speed up. So flip to the next one. Thank you. Which is just me saying, right, what next? So go straight to the next one. Look at this, we're chewing through the slides now. Just to note, this is not a process that's going to happen overnight. Changing any industry, let alone rail, takes a while, especially when financial situations aren't great. This is just to show, I think, that there's a build over 3 to 4 years of change, and benefits will come through after that, as well as that. The idea is this transformation is designed iteratively in stages to test it, to build it up, get people used to it, and also develop the capability to do it. That does mean that there is a challenge in how quickly people will feel change, how we galvanise ourselves, how we ensure that there is momentum, knowing that these things are difficult and they take time. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the scope of the programme. You can see it's large. That lovely man there is Conor Bailey. He's the SRO, he's DG Rail. He was also connected to the Williams Review, so it's very good to have him in charge. There's lots of points of this coming together in the department as the transformation programme. You can see me there on GBRTT and GBR. Obviously the most important bit, but just one bit among many. The important bit we haven't touched on is legislation. We need it. We need to change the important bits of the Railway Act to do this. And hopefully that will get started next year. It's a departmental responsibility. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, stay there, that's fine. We're getting to the important bit, which is great. The bit I'm most interested in. I will do this in 5 minutes and then take questions. I'm sorry. You will notice and give us feedback a little logo that we're working on there. See if you like it and what it says to you. It is transitionary. It is not GBR's logo. We've got a proper process for working that out. What it will be, what it will cover, and when it will be rolled out. That is in train. That is just our transition team logo. I should probably have got around to this earlier, but what is the transition team? Its goals are to deliver early white paper benefits and efficiencies, to design the end state of Great British Railways and develop a new culture and ways of working. Why is it needed? Because of the delay caused by COVID, the state of railway and country finances, and the fact that legislation takes a while to bring these changes through, we thought we needed a transition team to push some of this forward earlier. In original thinking years ago, it was going to be a nice newly built system, but there's no time. So for reasons of pace and efficiency, it's being grown out of Network Rail's corporate structure. I like to say it is in but not of Network Rail. We are highly ring-fenced, working to Andrew Haynes and Peter Henley, different structures, different decision-making frameworks. And this is our quite different set of goals, as you can see. We skip to the next slide, please. So these were the actual goals for final GBR that the Secretary of State announced last week at conference, and you'll see we're working towards, you can see the very first one there, the point I was iterating, this is not going to be Network Rail 2.0. What would be the point of that? Nothing against Network Rail, but it's not regulated or incentivized to be an industry guiding mind, so it isn't, and it can't be, so we need to be something different, and that is what we're trying to build, and that's one of the reasons we exist. Flip quickly to the next one, please. So I love the idea. This is the areas that we're focusing on at the moment. And the idea is that you provide expert advice and activity in each of those, start leading increasingly for the industry and provide whole industry thinking as far as is possible. I was going to briefly skim over each team, but there's not a huge amount of time. Most of them are obvious. The strategic freight one is setting up the strategic freight unit that William's talked about. Passenger revenue and marketing is development of what is currently the Rail Revenue Recovery Group, so a group of largely top secondees actually working with us to take a network-wide view of how you drive forward revenue initiatives. The industry commercial bit is looking at the different rules that might be needed to bring forward the passenger service contracts and the capability you need alongside the department. Customer focus, pretty much what it does on the tin. What are the customer pain points on one side that we can correct? So rolling out tactile paving properly. There's an accessibility issue, for instance, and getting information right. What is the long-term strategy that we want to put in place for the industry on the other point of to really make it customer focused and that cultural change. Strategic planning is dealing with the whole industry strategic plan and how we embed that. Business planning, financial management is looking at the information needed to get the whole industry profit and loss together. Digital and data services is trying to work through how we start accumulating data that can be used by all the industry and is recognized as such, and then building digital products off of that. And strategy and transformation is my little area, which is looking at how we build the phases of GBRTT and design GBR at the same time, working within the program. And the last substantive slide, next please. And this is just to say this is the iteration that we're going through along with the wider program. Stage one, we're setting up. We were launched by Secretary of State at conference, which is great. At the end of October, we have our internal readiness to go and stand up as our first phase, and then in November, the formal government process will finish for signing us off. So that's why it says autumn, bit of a lengthy one. It's an initiation phase. We're virtual. We're still a ring-fenced team within a bit of Network Rail. We're working with a range of secondees. We're trying to determine the culture. We're getting that activity and capability up. Stage 2 in April 22, we're spinning out and existing as a distinct legal entity. We'll have our own board. We're looking at that point there to start absorbing some of the functions of our RDG we can employ, and we'll start properly building a capability. Beyond that, we haven't determined yet further structures. It's a bit, it is tied to the wider development of the program in a particular legislation. When we can go and develop a shadow GBR, that might be late 22 at the earliest, maybe it might be later, and then 23, 24 for the final state that we're trying to design. And thank you for bearing with me being 5 minutes late and rushing at the end. But if you go to the last stage, there's some contacts. People want to ask questions that they don't get a chance to ask today. And we have a very modest website. Thank you. Sorry to have rushed that.
That's no problem. Thank you, Michael. Just before we get on to your Q&A, and there are a lot of questions for you, we just wanted to take a moment to thank our corporate members who fund YRP and its whole existence. Thank you to our committees who make events like this possible in terms of organising it. And if any of the audience members would like to get involved, please go to the website youngrailpro.com, where you can join a committee in your region and get more involved on things you'd like to get involved in. And from there, let's start the questions. So, this one is from Kimberly Lewin. As a key feedback tool for passengers to voice their experiences using the railway, to what extent did the National Rail Passenger Survey by Transport Focus feed into the Williams Rail Review?
Yeah, it's good. It did a lot. We looked at that survey. We talked to Transport Focus. They helped us run some additional bespoke passenger focus groups anonymously, and then they introduced some passenger focus groups interactively. And we were also looking at the wavelength tool that RDG have developed with Cox, which was in its early stage, and the information coming through there. So we're trying to triangulate a lot of that information, but it was very useful. Brilliant,
thank you. The next question comes from Nafisa Nathani. How much do you think the lack of diversity within the railway has led to insularity and a groupthink mentality? How important is a demographic shift to changing the culture within the railway so we get new perspectives and thinking to help transform this industry?
A lot and very would be my quick answer to that. I think it's a real problem. You know, even leaving aside the glaring moral challenge that it is to any industry, and rail is particularly bad as an industry. It has, as you say, so someone was saying to me earlier, the railway family is a really double-edged concept, because it's great in the same it's great and it's not great in the same way that families are. So, you know, that you stand together when the chips are down, you support each other. You know, you have rows, but you can get over it. But at the same time, if you're not in the family, you're not in the family, and it's quite difficult to get in, and there might be those barriers. So I don't want to labour that point, but it struck me as quite an interesting one, that actually, I think I said it, you need fresh thinking, you need different perspectives, you need the railway to reflect the people that are travelling on it and the people that work around it, and that is for every aspect of diversity. It is lagging, and I think it could do with a huge amount more and quickly.
Fantastic, thank you. The next question comes from Fotis Zapantis, and he asks, often we say rail is slow to innovate. The WR review acknowledged that, and my question is, compared to what?
Very good. My main comparative would be something like the other transport modes. So if you look at how quickly electric cars and the infrastructure are coming through, I mean, rail started earlier, you could argue, but the way the industry have got together to locate plant and set up batteries and get the government convinced to fund the infrastructure is miles better than how rail has got itself together to finish off its electrification job, which is stalled. Aeroplanes and the way the low-cost carriers, for example, and what they've done in the way not only revolutionising operations, not only but retail, and then you can compare rail with a lot of uses of digital and its retailing a lot more widely. But even within this, I mean, look at TfL as a good example of a more integrated transport system, and the Oyster card, which has been around for a long time now. And in fact, you can use Apple Pay, and that was pressed by Apple, I believe, not TfL, so you could walk through. Compared to the fragmentation you've got on rail in that respect, and how it's difficult to join up a retail offer, how the TOCs will have different retail websites. And look at Trainline, and outside of rail now, digital-based company, but doing a great job at frictionless retailing to customers that rail has not been able to emulate.
Thank you. The next question comes from Edmund Fenton Fowler. And the question is, have you read the book I Tried to Run a Railway, which Simon mentioned earlier? It's all about the railway restructure in the past century, and it'll be interesting to know what lessons from the past from our forefathers have been taken into account within the William Shapps Review.
I have not personally read it, actually, to be honest. I'm very bad at I actually studied for a history DPhil, and I think I've stopped reading history books since I finished that and started work. Must go back to it one day. But that was the reason we had embedded rail experts, and we did talk to a lot of rail. We had some rail historians that we talked to as part of that engagement to try and get that in. We talked to people that lived through the SRA experience, the last cohorts of the British Rail graduate schemes, etc. Try and actually get the living as well as the written history of it.
Fantastic, thank you. The next question comes from Jason Hodgson. Michael, you mentioned earlier that wage increases did not represent changes in the infrastructure/rail development. Should wage increase not first be compared to increase in RPI/CPI, and then the difference be applied to how much we should see an increase in work output? I say this purely from the point of view of a misconception that many employees from any industry do not appreciate that even though they receive their annual pay award, they actually may receive a pay cut if RPI/CPI is lower.
Yes, that's fair. in terms of any year at one point and then analyze it back. But if you look at the trend over kind of 20 to 30 years, rail wage increase does very much outstrip inflation. It also I want to be very careful here because I don't want to kind of assume this is for every. It differs. It's a bit of a nonsense saying the rail workforce in this regard, but some segments of it and all quite. It's different for each one, but the general trend has for it to be to outstrip other transport industries such as bus by a considerable amount and outstrip inflation at the same time. So there have been significant real terms increases for people like guards and people like train drivers. Network Rail is considered to be quite well paid, for example, as well. I'm not saying people going wrong. I'm not saying any of these people don't deserve the wage that they're on, but I'm saying that increase was not matched by other transport modes in a comparable time, nor inflation, nor did it lead to kind of product, nor was it necessarily traded off for productivity and workforce changes.
Thank you. The next question comes from Jake Savage. The rail reforms are a great opportunity to deliver a better railway for passengers and for freight operators, but is the industry pushing for cost cuts too soon, such as the voluntary severance schemes? And do you think that the industry/union relations can be managed effectively to deliver what is needed?
Good grief. I think if I knew the answer to that question, I'd be in a much better, well-paid job negotiating that at the moment.
Very spicy question tonight.
No, they're good. They're the right questions that we need to be asking. Otherwise, we won't challenge ourselves to do this properly. That's very hard. Do I think it's come too early? I noticed it's voluntary. I don't think so. I think the government has always, as I said, supported rail disproportionately to other modes of transport. That's but no reason it shouldn't. That's a perfectly logical policy position, but we should recognise that. And particularly during COVID, it has poured a huge amount of money into the industry to keep it going. Again, very sensible policy decision, but that cannot last. And the necessity being the mother of invention type of thing. I think it behoves everyone in the railway to think, look, what can we do more efficiently? What can we innovate to do better and not spend money at? There's another old adage that there was no problem the railway couldn't solve by throwing lots more money at it type of thing. And I think there's a bit of a mindset change that's needed across the piece, because it from a general rail and wider economic perspective, we have to play our part in supporting the Treasury getting back on an even keel. As to better people than me will be negotiating how that is done. And just to add, the Great British Railways Transition Team is not actively involved in kind of voluntary severance or discussions about workforce reform. That's at the department and with the relative organisations responsible.
Thank you. So we've got 5 minutes to go. With that, only a couple more questions. Unfortunately, we won't get time to get through all of the mountains of questions we've had people asking. So the next question is, with Southeastern losing their franchise after, quotes, serious breach of trust, what do you think the ramifications of this will be in the industry as a whole? And do you think the fraud investigation will widen? And do you think this has put a final nail in the coffin for the franchise system? Very interesting question. Lots of layers there.
Yes, lots that I'm not going to answer. So look, I don't know anything more than I've read in on the news about what happened and why it happened. And if I did, I probably wouldn't be able to tell you. So I don't think it's useful for me to speculate on that. I think personally, this might be my thing. I think the franchise was, as we've announced, the franchise system was dead several times beforehand. So I don't think that, whether that, puts another headstone on it. But it was announced, before COVID as a consequence of the review, I think by Chris Grayling maybe at the time, that franchising was dead. COVID, as Simon said, completely put it in its coffin type of thing. So I don't see. I see the Southeastern as some oddity in contract management. I don't think it was. I think it was relatively well performing from what I know at the time. So I just assume that was a cock up of some form or other, the department and between the department and the top, rather than a systemic problem that highlights a change that is needed. But as I said, I don't know what I don't know.
Perfect, thank you. We've got one final question from Gareth Richards, involving sort of GBR and devolution. As rail services in Scotland and Wales are devolved to the Welsh and Scottish governments, how will GBR affect ScotRail and Transport for Wales? Will the Scottish and Welsh governments still have autonomy to run ScotRail and TfW services as they do now?
Yes, good question on devolution, and absolutely, the settlement and the current arrangements were not touched at all by Williams. So what we have now is an interesting discussion to be had with Scottish and Welsh governments about how GBR can and the new sectoral design and the new rules on access and the new contractual approach to PSCs might interact with services in Scotland and Wales contracted through those governments. But no, it is neutral to the devolution. I think Keith rightly said that this is a political issue, not a railway issue. And so what we need to do is make it work for all sides with the railway.
Fantastic. And with that, a lot of the other questions are very long, so I'm afraid I'll have to apologise to our audience and ask them to take their questions to the inquiries page that was up just now. Thank you very, very much for answering, and thank you to our audience for asking some fantastic questions. Over to Jacob.
Yeah, just want to echo Bonnie's points on thank you for the audience for participating and asking some really good and interesting questions, and thank you to Michael and Simon and all of the other speakers who've been part of this event. Just a reminder, please do check out the Young Rail Professionals website for the upcoming events. The next one is Monday, like I said. And thank you very much for your time, and do get in touch if you've got any feedback or any specific questions for us. So thank you for that. And we will close the event now. Thank you.